The bank manager's office was small and windowless, the kind of place where difficult conversations happened behind closed doors, and Thomas Webb sat across the desk feeling like the floor had disappeared beneath him. His hands, weathered and spotted with age, gripped the armrests of the chair so hard his knuckles had gone white. The statement in front of him showed a number that didn't make sense. 0. His account balance was 0, but yesterday it had been $63,427. 63 years of savings, 63 years of putting away $10 here, $50 there, living carefully, spending nothing he didn't have to, building something that was supposed to keep him safe when he got too old to work. And now it was gone. All of it. Vanished overnight like it had never existed. The bank manager, a woman named Jennifer Hartwell who couldn't have been older than 40, sat with her hands folded on the desk, her face arranged in an expression that was supposed to look sympathetic, but mostly looked tired. She had been explaining something about unauthorized transactions and investigation protocols and timelines for resolution, but Thomas wasn't hearing the words anymore. He was just staring at that 0 and thinking about what it meant. No money for rent, no money for food, no money for the medications that kept his heart beating and his blood pressure stable. 94 years old, and he was starting over with nothing. But then Jennifer Hartwell said something that made Thomas look up. She said it quietly, like she was afraid someone might hear through the walls. She said, "Mr. Webb, I need to tell you something I'm not supposed to tell you." And what came next would crack open a scandal so massive that within 3 weeks, federal investigators would be crawling through every file in that bank, and within 3 months, the entire financial institution would cease to exist. 11 months earlier, Thomas Webb's morning routine was the same as it had been for the past 15 years, ever since his wife Martha passed and left him alone in the small house they'd bought in 1967. He woke at 5:30, made coffee in the same percolator they'd gotten as a wedding gift, fried 2 eggs and 1 piece of toast, read the newspaper front to back while he ate, even though his eyes weren't what they used to be and he had to hold the pages close to make out the smaller print. Then he'd wash his dishes, put them in the drainer, and decide what needed doing that day. At 94, there wasn't much that needed doing anymore. The house was paid off decades ago. The garden was smaller each year because his back couldn't take the bending and his knees couldn't take the kneeling. He didn't drive anymore, hadn't since he'd failed the vision test 2 years back. So most days he just stayed home. His daughter, Linda, called twice a week from Arizona. His son, Robert, came by once a month when he could get away from work. But mostly, Thomas was alone. And that was okay. He'd learned to be alone, learned to make peace with the quiet. But the quiet brought thinking. And thinking brought worry, because Thomas knew the math wasn't working anymore. His Social Security was $912 a month. The house was paid off, but there were still property taxes, insurance, utilities, maintenance. Things broke. The water heater had died last year. The roof needed replacing soon, the inspector had said, maybe 2 years before it started leaking. And then there was food, medicine, the small expenses that added up faster than $912 could cover them. So Thomas had his savings. $63,427. He checked the balance every month, logging into the bank's website on the old computer Robert had set up for him, moving the mouse carefully, squinting at the screen. The number gave him comfort. It was a cushion, a safety net, enough for emergencies, to fix what broke, to keep him in his house until the end. He'd worked for that money. 47 years as a machinist at the Ford plant back when American cars were still made by American hands in American factories. He'd worked overtime when it was offered, skipped lunches to save money, driven the same truck for 20 years because buying a new one seemed wasteful. And every paycheck, he'd put something away. Not much. They'd never had much, but something. Always something. Martha had been the same way, careful with money. Not cheap, just careful. She'd clipped coupons and bought store brands and turned the thermostat down at night. She'd sewn patches on their children's jeans instead of buying new ones. She'd made casseroles that stretched 1 pound of ground beef across 3 meals. And when she died, after 46 years of marriage, Thomas had found a coffee can in the back of her closet with $3,000 in cash. Money she'd saved without telling him, just in case. Just in case something happened to him and she needed it. He'd sat on the bedroom floor holding that coffee can and cried harder than he'd cried at her funeral. Because that's who Martha was. Always thinking ahead. Always preparing. So Thomas tried to do the same. He was careful. He didn't waste. He ate simply. He kept the heat low in winter and the air conditioning off in summer. He wore the same clothes until they couldn't be worn anymore, then bought replacements from the thrift store. And he checked his bank account every month, making sure the number was still there, still real, still protecting him. In March, he noticed something odd. A charge he didn't recognize. $79.99 listed as an online purchase. Thomas didn't make online purchases, didn't know how. The only thing he used the computer for was checking his bank account and reading the news. He called the bank, spent 45 minutes on hold listening to music that cut out every 30 seconds, then finally got a representative who sounded young and bored. He explained about the charge. The representative asked him questions. Had he given his card to anyone? Had he lost his wallet? Had he clicked on any suspicious emails? No, no, and no. The representative said she'd file a dispute, said it would take 7 to 10 business days to investigate, said the money would be refunded if the charge was determined to be fraudulent. Thomas thanked her and hung up. 3 weeks later, the $79.99 was back in his account. Thomas felt relieved. The system had worked. But then in May, it happened again. This time 3 separate charges. $43, $112, $67.50, all listed as online purchases. All from companies he'd never heard of. Thomas called the bank again. Same hold music, same questions, same process. File a dispute, wait 7 to 10 business days. The money was refunded eventually, but Thomas was starting to feel uneasy. By July, the charges were coming every week. Small amounts, usually under $100, always listed as online purchases. Thomas would call the bank, file disputes, wait for refunds. It became a routine. A frustrating, time-consuming routine that made him feel stupid and helpless, like he'd done something wrong but didn't know what. The bank representatives always asked the same questions. Was he clicking on links in emails? Was he giving his information to strangers? And Thomas, who barely used email and never talked to strangers, would say, "No, I'm not doing anything. I don't understand how this is happening." In August, Robert came by for his monthly visit, and Thomas mentioned the problem. Robert, who worked in IT and understood computers better than Thomas ever would, asked to see the laptop. He spent an hour looking through settings, running scans, checking for viruses or malware, found nothing. The computer was clean. Robert changed all of Thomas's passwords anyway, made them longer, more complicated, wrote them down on a piece of paper and taped it to the inside of a kitchen drawer where Thomas would remember, but no one else would find it. He said, "Dad, I think someone got your card number. You might need to cancel the card and get a new one." Thomas called the bank the next day, explained the situation, asked for a new debit card. The representatives said they'd mail one out, should arrive in 7 to 10 business days, and in the meantime, they'd deactivate the old card. Thomas felt better. Problem solved. But the charges didn't stop. Even with the old card deactivated, even with new passwords, the fraudulent charges kept appearing. $50 here, $90 there, sometimes multiple charges in a single day. And Thomas kept calling the bank, kept filing disputes, kept waiting for refunds. But now the refunds were taking longer. 10 business days became 15. 15 became 20. And Thomas's account balance, that number he checked every month for comfort, was starting to shrink. By October, he'd lost almost $8,000 to fraudulent charges that hadn't been refunded yet. The bank kept saying they were investigating, kept saying it was complicated, kept saying he needed to be patient. But Thomas didn't have patience anymore. He had fear. Because $8,000 was a lot of money. And if it didn't come back, if the bank decided those charges were somehow his fault, somehow his responsibility, then his safety net was getting smaller. And he was 94 years old. He didn't have time to rebuild.
Linda called one Sunday in late October, and Thomas, who usually told his children everything was fine, who didn't want to worry them, broke down, told her about the charges, about the disputes, about the $8,000 that was gone and might not come back. Linda was furious, said she was calling the bank herself, said this was elder abuse, said they needed to fix this immediately. Thomas told her not to bother, that it would just make things complicated. But Linda didn't listen. She called the bank, spent 2 hours on the phone being transferred from department to department, and finally got through to a supervisor who promised to escalate the case, who said someone from the fraud department would reach out within 48 hours. Nobody reached out. November came and the temperature dropped, and Thomas turned the heat on for the first time that season, but only to 60 degrees, because he was watching every penny now. The fraudulent charges had stopped, finally, after the third debit card replacement, but the refunds still hadn't come through. His account balance was sitting at $55,412, $8,000 short. And the bank wasn't answering his calls anymore. He'd tried 6 times in 2 weeks. Each time, he'd wait on hold for an hour, then get disconnected. Or he'd reach someone who'd say they'd transfer him to the fraud department, and then he'd end up back in the hold queue. Robert came by in early December and saw how stressed his father looked. Saw the way Thomas's hands shook when he talked about the bank. Saw the notes Thomas had taped to the wall next to the phone. Dates and times and names of representatives he'd spoken to, a paper trail of a problem no one seemed willing to solve. Robert said, "Dad, I think you need to go to the bank in person. Talk to someone face to face." Thomas didn't want to. Didn't like leaving the house. Didn't like feeling helpless. But Robert insisted. Said he'd drive him. Said they'd go together. They went on a Tuesday morning. The bank was downtown, in a building that used to be grand but now just looked tired. Robert parked close to the entrance and helped Thomas out of the car. Inside, the branch was quiet. A few tellers behind plexiglass, a row of desks where people in business casual clothes typed on computers. Robert walked Thomas up to one of the desks and explained the situation to a young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The young man listened, nodded, said he'd need to get a manager, then disappeared into the back. 20 minutes later, Jennifer Hartwell appeared. She introduced herself as the branch manager, asked Thomas and Robert to follow her to her office, and that's where they sat, in that small windowless room, while Jennifer pulled up Thomas's account on her computer and frowned. She asked questions, the same questions Thomas had been asked 100 times. He answered patiently, his voice tired. And then Jennifer said something that made Robert sit forward in his chair. She said, "Mr. Webb, I'm seeing something here that doesn't look right. These charges were flagged as fraudulent back in March. All of them. The investigation was completed in April. You should have been refunded months ago." Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. Then why wasn't I? Jennifer's frown deepened. "I don't know. Let me make a call." She picked up her phone, dialed an extension, spoke in low tones to someone on the other end, then hung up and looked at Thomas with an expression that had shifted from professional concern to something closer to alarm. She said, "Mr. Webb, I need to check something. Do you mind waiting here for a few minutes?" Thomas and Robert waited. 10 minutes. 15. When Jennifer came back, her face was pale. She sat down, took a breath, and said, "I need to ask you something. Have you made any large purchases recently? Anything over $1,000? No, Thomas said. Have you written any checks? No. Have you authorized anyone else to access your account? No. Jennifer nodded slowly, then pulled up something on her screen, turned the monitor so Thomas could see, and there in the transaction history were withdrawals Thomas had never made. Electronic transfers, $2,500, $3,800, $4,200. All within the past 3 weeks. All sent to an account Thomas didn't recognize. Someone had been draining his savings, not slowly, the way the fraudulent charges had, but deliberately, systematically. And as of this morning, when the last transfer had gone through, Thomas's account balance was 0.
Thomas couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. He just stared at the screen, at the list of transactions that had erased 63 years of his life. Robert was on his feet, angry, demanding answers. Who authorized this? How did this happen? Why weren't we notified? Jennifer was shaking her head. This shouldn't have been possible. These transfers should have been flagged. There are protocols, safeguards. She was clicking through screens now, her fingers moving fast, and Thomas could see the panic in her eyes. She said, "I need to escalate this, right now." But then she stopped, stared at something on the screen, and her face went from pale to gray. She looked at Thomas, looked at Robert, and said, "There's an internal note here from one of our fraud investigators. It says the account was cleared for transfers. It says you authorized them." "I didn't," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "I never authorized anything." Jennifer's hands were shaking now. She said, "I believe you, Mr. Webb, and I think something very wrong has happened here." She got up, locked her office door, came back to her desk, and then she said the thing she wasn't supposed to say, the thing that would end her career at this bank, but save Thomas's life. She said, "Mr. Webb, I'm going to tell you something I could be fired for telling you, but you need to know. This isn't the first time this has happened. We've had 17 other cases in the past 6 months, all elderly customers, all savings accounts, all drained through electronic transfers that were supposedly authorized by the account holders. And in every case, the bank found a reason to deny responsibility. Said the customers must have been careless with their information, said they must have clicked on a phishing link or given someone their password. But I don't think that's what happened. I think someone inside this bank has been stealing from customers, and I think they've been covering it up." The room went silent. Thomas felt like he might be sick. Robert said, "Do you have proof?" Jennifer shook her head. "Not proof, just patterns, just suspicions. But if I'm right, if this is internal fraud, then we're talking about a crime, a big one, and it needs to be reported." "Then report it," Robert said. Jennifer looked at him. "If I report this internally, it'll get buried. I've seen it happen before. But if you report it, if you go to the police, to the FBI, to the state attorney general, then it becomes something they can't ignore." So that's what they did. Robert drove Thomas straight to the police station, filed a report. The officer who took the report looked skeptical at first, like this was just another case of an elderly person getting confused. But when Robert mentioned the 17 other victims and the possibility of internal fraud, the officer's expression changed. He said he'd forward this to the Financial Crimes Unit, said someone would be in touch. They were in touch within 2 days. Not local police, federal agents. 2 of them, dressed in suits, who showed up at Thomas's house and spent 3 hours asking questions, taking notes, making copies of every document Thomas had, every bank statement, every dispute filing, every note he'd taped to the wall. And when they left, one of them, a woman with gray hair and sharp eyes, said, "Mr. Webb, we're going to look into this, and if what we suspect is true, you're going to get your money back, all of it." But getting it back took time. The investigation took months. The FBI subpoenaed records from the bank, interviewed employees, analyzed transaction patterns, and what they found was worse than anyone had imagined. It wasn't one person stealing from elderly customers. It was a network, 3 employees in the fraud department who had been identifying vulnerable accounts belonging to people over 80 who didn't check their balances often, who didn't understand technology, who wouldn't notice right away if money went missing. They'd create fake fraud reports, fake investigation notes, fake authorizations. And then they'd transfer money out of those accounts into shell accounts they controlled. They'd been doing it for almost 2 years, had stolen over $1 million from 43 customers. The employees were arrested in February, charged with wire fraud, identity theft, elder abuse. The bank, facing a federal investigation and a public relations nightmare, tried to settle quietly, offered to refund Thomas's money in exchange for his silence. But Thomas, who'd spent his whole life being quiet, who'd never made trouble, who'd always followed the rules, said no. He wanted everyone to know what had happened, wanted every other elderly person in that bank to know their money wasn't safe, wanted the bank held accountable.
So he didn't settle. He sued. And Linda, who flew in from Arizona to help, contacted a lawyer who specialized in elder financial abuse. And the lawyer, a man named David Chen, who'd been waiting for a case like this, filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of all 43 victims. The lawsuit didn't just seek refunds. It sought punitive damages. It sought policy changes. It sought to make an example out of a bank that had let its employees prey on its most vulnerable customers for years. The case made national news. Reporters showed up at Thomas's house. He didn't want to talk to them at first. Didn't like the attention. But Linda convinced him. Said his story mattered. Said it could help other people. So Thomas sat on his porch and told his story to cameras and journalists, his voice shaking but steady. And he said the thing that would become the headline everyone remembered. He said, "I'm 94 years old. I worked my whole life for that money, and they took it like I didn't matter. Like I was already dead and they were just taking what was left." The public response was immediate and overwhelming. People were outraged. How could a bank allow this? How could employees steal from elderly customers for 2 years without anyone noticing? How many other banks were doing the same thing? The bank's stock dropped. Customers closed accounts. Protests formed outside branch locations. And the bank, unable to withstand the pressure, collapsed. Not immediately, but over the course of 6 months, bleeding customers and money and credibility, until finally the board voted to dissolve the institution and sell its assets to a larger bank. Thomas got his money back. All of it, plus interest, plus a settlement payment that brought his total to almost $90,000, more than he'd started with. The other 42 victims got their money back too, and the 3 employees who'd stolen from them were convicted and sentenced to federal prison. But for Thomas, the money wasn't the point anymore. The point was that he'd fought back, that he'd refused to let them get away with it, that he'd stood up for himself and for every other person who'd been told they didn't matter. Jennifer Hartwell, the bank manager who'd risked her career to tell him the truth, lost her job. The bank fired her for violating confidentiality agreements, but she didn't regret it. She told reporters she'd do it again. And David Chen, the lawyer, hired her to work at his firm, helping investigate financial crimes against elderly victims. Thomas lived for another year after the settlement. He used some of the money to fix his roof, to replace the water heater, to buy groceries without counting every penny. But mostly he just lived, sat on his porch, read his newspaper, called his children. And every morning when he woke up at 5:30 and made his coffee and fried his eggs, he thought about how close he'd come to losing everything. How the system had failed him, but how people, individual people who chose to do the right thing even when it was hard, had saved him. He died peacefully in his sleep on a Thursday morning in March, 95 years old, in his house, in his bed,
with $90,000 in the bank and his dignity intact. And at his funeral, which was attended by his children and grandchildren, and Jennifer Hartwell and David Chen, and 2 of the FBI agents who'd worked his case, Robert stood up and said something that made everyone in that room cry. He said, "My father taught me that the most important thing you can do in life is stand up when it would be easier to sit down, to speak up when it would be easier to stay quiet, to fight when it would be easier to surrender." And at 94 years old, when most people would have just accepted what happened, my father fought, and he won. The case led to new regulations, federal oversight of bank fraud departments, mandatory reporting protocols, protections for whistleblowers like Jennifer, and a national hotline for elderly financial abuse that helped thousands of people in the years that followed. Thomas Webb never set out to change the system. He just wanted his money back. But sometimes that's how change happens. One person refusing to accept injustice. One person demanding accountability. One person mattering enough to make a difference. If you want more stories about people who refused to be victims, who fought back against systems that tried to silence them, feel free to like this video. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next story. And here's my question for you. What would you have done in Thomas's situation? Would you have accepted the quiet settlement, or would you have fought for accountability? Have you or someone you love ever been targeted by financial fraud? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because the only way we protect each other is by telling these stories, by staying vigilant, and by remembering that every person, no matter their age, matters.